"You're a cadet playing dress-up," the gatekeeper barked, voice ricocheting off the steel boots of Range 6. The crowd laughed like a pack of hyenas that had learned the joke before the words finished falling. Silence was expected as protocol. Instead, there was a low ripple of amused cruelty. She did not flinch. She did not look up. Her hands were at work on a worn M110-style chassis, an M210 enhanced sniper variant in all but name. Fingers moving with the calm of someone who could set a watch by their heartbeat. The gatekeeper's smirk broadened into a grin made for cameras and for asserting dominion. "This isn't your photo op, kid. Drop the rifle, step back, let the real Marines handle the lane." The crowd laughed harder. Some of the younger marksmen nodded, eager to be part of the chorus. Her face remained a desert in winter, still, clean, composed. But when the colonel glanced over, he paused at the trajectory of her shoulders, the way her right thumb rested along the safety, the micro-adjustments in her stance that betrayed not inexperience, but long, practiced repetition. If you've ever seen a tree that's been pruned for decades into perfect form, you saw her posture. If you believe that quiet competence is the last thing the loud will ever respect, type respect below. The range's fluorescent lights hummed like distant rotors as the drill sergeant, gatekeeper to most present, Simon to those who'd eaten MREs with him in winter rain, continued his performance. He favored volume because he lacked nuance. He wielded scorn because he feared being proven wrong. "You think you can post up here with that relic and teach us a thing?" he spat, theatrically peering over his sunglasses to scan the group for corroboration. "Show us your ID. Show us your certs. We don't accommodate fairy tales." The phrase hung ugly and loud. Around him, the junior enlisted shifted, half shame, half glee, because public humiliation is a cheap admission ticket to belonging. The protagonist, known to the few who'd spoken to her as Morgan, lifted the bolt carrier with steady hands, slotted in an en-bloc clip, set the chamber with the mechanical finality of someone who respects machines more than noise. Her uniform was serviceable, nondescript. No badges that screamed. No patches that required explanation. A worn stock, scuffed in a single, telltale corner where an old sling had rubbed over years. No flourish, only function. The gatekeeper's face tightened. "Name," he demanded. A dozen voices waited for the punchline, for the reveal of nothing. Morgan's voice answered, flat, precise, not a syllable wasted. "Yes, sir." That small sentence was a silence folded tight. A training alarm keened, an exercise signal that turned the laughter into purposeful movement. The lane went cold hot, targets inked, silhouettes on timers, a scenario meant to prod and expose. A drill officer called the problem. A simulated TOC compromise, hostiles moving behind a 300-meter berm, non-combatants in the forward observation post, a moment where hesitation equals catastrophe. The gatekeeper saw green paper and career theater, an opportunity to grandstand. "Cadet," he said loudly so everyone could hear, "support team, you will hold while the experts clear the hill. No heroics." He snapped orders with the satisfaction of someone pointing at a map he had not read. Morgan moved like someone taking off a coat. Quick, unassuming, efficient. She measured wind at the muzzle, checked the zero with an old-school parallax glance, thumbed the ballistic calculator in her head, not on a device. Her breathing cycled. Inhale, settle, exhale. Tiny rituals that had kept people alive in thin places. A few of the onlookers had seen marksmen before. They knew the theatrics of chest-thumping shooters who made a lot of noise and fired too early. They did not, at that moment, recognize the difference between noise and the metronomic work of a professional. In the distance, a convoy's simulation idled, and the sound of distant engines felt like a heartbeat. The gatekeeper looked for applause. Instead, something older as Weather watched the scene. The colonel's eyes had narrowed into a map of memory. The exercise expanded into a moment of truth, an insurgent graded steel silhouette at 300 meters, a blinking red light on its chest signaling a compromised target that must not be hit if a civilian figure blocked the line of fire. Rules of engagement were tight. The scenario required precise judgment and a single, clean resolution. Morgan slotted around, settled the rifle into the crook of her shoulder, and exhaled. The world contracted to a billiard of light and shadow. The light over Range 6, the dust motes retracing the path of a spent round. The faint metallic smell of brass warmed by friction. Details only the still warning in a mind tuned to consequence notices. The gatekeeper sneered. You gonna wait until he moves, tuner? His sarcasm was a whip. He had stacked the crowd, primed them for the spectacle of her failure. She did not answer. A pro moves in silence. She adjusted the diopter, checked the wind flags. 8 degrees right at full bore. Calculated holdover in microseconds, and looked through the scope as if she were reading a page that refused to lie. Her finger found the trigger with the slow inevitability of tide meeting sand. Then the shot. The trigger broke with the sound of a bell struck in a distant barracks. The round climbed like a promise and then sank. It struck the steel silhouette not in anger, but in the kindness of precision, just to the left of the blinking red, but not touching it. A bullet that removed the enemy, without harming the simulated civilian in the foreground. A clean bullet hole that passed through the periphery of the torso, the margin of error shrouded in deliberate perfection. Silence imploded. A chair scraped. A young corporal swallowed. The noise in the range receded to a single thing, the cartridge hitting the sand. The gatekeeper's braggadocio fell like daylight through a pane, sharp lines of disbelief. That's not possible, he said, voice fragile at the edges. Morgan looked up finally, the smallest gesture, and the colonel's jaw unclenched like a man being offered a mirror by fate. The shot was not loud. Its consequence was loud. People forget that competence often announces itself not with a drum, but with the hush after an act that makes pretense impossible. The colonel crossed the range in 3 long strides and stood beside Morgan with the gait of someone whose life had been spent corralling storm. He did not clap. He did not engage in theater. He simply observed the stock, the way the scope ring had a tiny mark, 2 hairline scratches that matched an old maintenance diagram he'd once filed away. And then, with the authority of a man who had known soldiers who earned their silence, he put a hand on her shoulder. Iron Wolf Vet, he said, voice low and immovable, like a gavel finding its table. Stand by. The title convulsed across the crowd like a new currency. Iron Wolf, an old unit, sometimes scorned as myth, sometimes spoken of only in classified corridors, resonated. The gatekeeper's face, which had been a red banner moments before, drained to ash. He tried to recalibrate the insult, to pivot to protocol or rank or age, but the words dissolved. The presence of the colonel and his single, final phrase did what argument could not. It changed the axis of the room. A personnel file was requested and produced with bureaucratic reluctance. Digital records summoned, service numbers cross-checked. The validator, the colonel, did not trumpet credentials. He recited them with the cadence of a man reading names off a roll call of ghosts and heroes. Unit, Iron Wolf Special Reconnaissance. Combat hours, 2,176. Medals, Silver Star, 5 air medals, 3 bronze stars. This operator has been shot at, returned fire, and fixed problems the books never taught. Each number landed like a hammer. The gatekeeper's insults turned brittle and fell apart like dry mortar. The crowd leaned in as the colonel outlined the record in low, definite sentences, each a cut that made the gatekeeper feel smaller by degrees. Morgan answered only once more. Understood, that was all she allowed of language, and it was enough. The validator removed his cover, a plain salute performed without ceremony, but loaded with recognition. It was the kind of salute that says, I have seen what you have done, and I will not let this room pretend otherwise. The gatekeeper tried to recover with a joke that landed like a wet blanket. So you're telling us whoever taught you broke the handbook? He half laughed, as if to insist that institutional knowledge still mattered more than field-born craft. The colonel did not smile. He spoke with a short, razor certainty. Assumptions are for the untested. Skill is for the proven. The gatekeeper's shoulders dropped in surrender. There was no audience left to support his sneer. The onlookers, who had been predisposed to enjoy a spectacle of humiliation, felt the air move under their feet. Some avoided the gaze of Morgan, not out of disrespect, but because they had been taught a lesson through the violence of truth. Over the following days the story spread like the sudden warm current of rumor through the barracks. The Iron Wolf vet who had been dressed down in public and then, in a single measured act, rendered the loudness of doubters moot. The tale moved from Range 6 to Chow Hall to the private threads of the unit's online forums. where names and details watered the legend. A 20-second clip of the shot, filmed unobtrusively by a young lance corporal, circulated with the headline, "Cadet? Iron Wolf vets don't need caps. The internet loves a neat arc," and what began as cruel theater reshaped into narrative justice. The gatekeeper found himself the subject of ribbing, the butt of quiet jokes, people miming the wide, desperate grin he'd worn when he thought cruelty would be accepted. He floundered at first, defensive, then reflective, then, unexpectedly, contrite. He sought Morgan in the line one morning as she adjusted her sling, the man's voice small and awkward. I meant no disrespect," he offered. Morgan's eyes registered him, brief and untroubled. "Understood," she said. No triumph, no gloating, a closing of a ledger. Her silence taught more than his apology could. Time has a way of gilding details, and in Barrack's lore the rifle's scar acquired backstory. That scrape on the stock was the mark of a fall in a Black Hawk landing where a teammate had broken a leg. The small nick on the scope ring came from a firefight where the optics clogged with grit and a hand steadied it at the last heartbeat. Those stories multiplied in the telling because humans collect meaning the way sailors collect knots. People began to use the episode as a lesson in briefings, assume competence, verify skill, respect earned. Commanders used it as a parable in instruction blocks for new arrivals, reading out Morgan's file with the same reverent brevity as ancient texts. Unit: Iron Wolf. Combat hours: 2,176. They read aloud, learners listening like pilgrims. The gatekeeper became a cautionary anecdote in those classes, the man who tried to humiliate a veteran and instead found himself taught a costly lesson about pride. The photo taken of Morgan after the sergeant major had pinned a small commendation to her chest, a quiet, utilitarian ribbon, was posted on a board by the heater in the common room. Someone labeled it Morgan Line. The label stuck because people are fond of naming things that change behavior. Morgan's life did not tilt toward fame. She returned to the rhythm that defined her: maintenance, teaching, quiet counsel. Younger marksmen sought her out, not for instruction and bravado, but for drills and patience. She taught them to breathe into tasks, to measure wind in degrees, not sentiment, to understand that a steady hand is less spectacle and more covenant. Her instruction was minimalistic: watch, adjust, correct. She defended the concept of legacy not as relic, but as usable tool. Precision is learned. Silence is practice. She refused interviews that sought to lampoon or Leoneize. When asked why she never boasted, she replied, once, in a stairwell with a recruit who would repeat the line like scripture, "I don't collect praise. I collect results." That sentence, spare and implacable, became as much a part of the Iron Wolf legend as the file itself. The gatekeeper, when he passed Morgan in the mess hall, would nod. Each nod was a small repair to his pride. He sought her advice on protocol once, and she gave it to him bluntly. He listened, and he learned. He watched the old arrogance in him erode into a quieter authority that now had humility baked into it. Months later, the colonel spoke at a ceremony where young service members were being advanced. He referenced the Range 6 incident not as gossip, but as model. "We measure soldiers not by the noise they make, but by the things they fix when the noise falls away," he said, voice like a sealed envelope breaking. Names were called. Salutes were rendered. The photograph of Morgan, iron-willed, rifle at rest, gaze forward, was humming softly in the background like an echo. New recruits, fresh as uncut lumber, repeated the lesson. They were taught to hold assumptions in check and to test competence in the field, not in the forums of petty power. The legend of Iron Wolf became a module in leadership courses, a short, hard lesson against institutional arrogance. Morgan watched from the back, hands folded, expression unreadable. Someone asked if she resented the noise that had to be broken before truth could show itself. She looked at them as one might look at a watch with a cracked face, half sad, half amused. "No," she said, and in that monosyllable there was the wealth of a long night by a campfire. Silence has economies. Years would shift contexts, and the lance corporal who had filmed the shot would one day retell the tale to a classroom of eager, nervous faces as part of a leadership module. He would show the clip and pause it at the instant the brass case hit the sand, eyes sweeping over the watchers. "Notice the room," he would instruct. Listen to what's left when the talking stops. The gatekeeper's apology, once belabored, became a straightforward recollection. I learned to ask before I judged. He had become, in small but meaningful ways, the better version of himself, one who used voice to build rather than to break. The community stitched the event into institutional memory. A small plaque was affixed to the range's wall, a simple line, pithy and official, that read, "Where assumptions were corrected by action, it was not dramatic." No one wanted drama at Range 6. They wanted clarity. In the end, the story carried a lesson not because it was sensational, but because it was true. Quiet competence did not scream for attention. It did not crave the spotlight. It performed its work and left behind the evidence needed to rewrite prejudice. Morgan kept her rifle clean, her files up to date, and her cadence unchanged. When promotions came, they were eventually issued without fanfare, the way truth has a way of being folded into the formal record, clean, inevitable, and quietly final. And the validator, the colonel, retired with the satisfaction of a man who had used his authority to shield truth against scorn. He would later say, in a voice that could cut through a parade ground, "Respect is not an initial condition. It's a ledger you keep by watching people when they do the work." That line was carved, proverb-like, into the next generation's ethos. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where stoic professionalism defines worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories. The plaque glinted under the fluorescent strip lighting of Range 6, dull and official, but it did not need to shout. People stopped by it the way they paused at an altar, with hands in pockets, with a shake of the head, with the small private vow not to be the one who tried to speak over someone's work again. Morgan never stood in front of it. She walked past it, like anyone else, eyes forward, the way someone who owns no vanity moves through a world that keeps inventing mirrors for her to look into. There were days, more than a few, when recruits would come to her and ask, evasive, whether she minded being the subject of a story. Her answer was the same each time, a brief tilt of the chin, a small, practical smile that never reached the eyes the way a boast would. "It's training," she would say. "It's a lesson." Then she would hand them a rag and point to a rifle. Cleaning is a kind of prayer here, she thought. It was quieter than most. Life after Range 6 did not stretch into myth for Morgan. She did not write a book or give interviews. When the cameras came, local news that smelled faintly of coffee and cheap perfume. She declined through the chain of command, citing regulations and a need for operational security. The colonel respected that and thanked the reporters on her behalf, offering instead a statement about the integrity of the force and the danger of letting ignorance define policy. The gatekeeper, to his credit, did not chase the headlines. He lived in a smaller orbit now, chastened by his own voice and the memory of the brass case hitting sand. He volunteered for extra instructing hours, letting the recruits see a humbler version of him. He still had the habit of speaking loudly in rooms full of men and women who did not necessarily need to hear his voice, but his words had a new quality. They were cautious, measured, a man testing them first in his head. Small things changed. He learned to ask. He learned to listen. The lesson cost him pride and, briefly, sleep, but he slept better when he did manage to be the first to offer medical aid in a drill. At mess, he sometimes left an empty seat for silence. Morgan's days folded into one another with a domestic sort of heroism. Mornings began before dawn on the concrete apron, the smell of diesel and waxed leather and cold metal clinging to the air. She moved through the hangars with the patient expectation of someone who knew the machinery of consequence. The M210 stayed in its case unless a mission demanded it, and even then it was treated like a living thing. Wiped, inspected, measured for cadence and balance the way a musician checks the tuning of an instrument. Strict attention to small things was how she honored the larger ones. When she was off duty, she did not linger at bars or on social feeds. She read manuals, maps, history texts, and the occasional verse that had been passed down in scrapbooks among veterans. The words that stayed with her were short and faithful. Keep your head, do your job, mind your aim. There was, in the months that followed, a series of small but steady aftershocks. The clip the Lance Corporal had filmed went down into a server, and then, like many things made from bits, it went out into an economy of attention where veracity is negotiable but the GIF is sacred. It played on private channels first, in barracks and on off-duty forums, discussed in terms of technique and accident and cruelty. Later it migrated to public spaces where opinions were currency and outrage was the quickest way to mine a profit. Most of what passed for commentary was noise. Someone trying to make a point about institutional sexism, someone else trying to turn it into a meme. A few commentators did what the colonel had done. They watched closely, paused the frame at the instant the brass case struck sand, and wrote in the careful cadence of people who knew the language of small things. Those posts mattered. They filtered back, like clarifying rain, into the training rooms and the chow lines. Words that were measured have a way of traveling in ways louder claims cannot. Morgan's story started to be assigned to the same category as certain other instructive stories. The mountain pilot who flew through icing and lived, the medic who bled to death in a forward operating base while saving a platoon, the small-town constable who called for backup rather than taking a reckless shot. It was a long list. Each item carried a fact that could be measured, a time, a distance, a precise technical choice. The lesson attached itself to inventory. Assumptions, instructors told new classes, are the only thing worse than bad aim. They taught recruits to notice how the world looks when people stop talking and begin to do what matters. There were exercises built explicitly around the Range 6 clip. The gatekeeper, now an instructor who had been through the humility necessary to be useful, brought it into his lesson plans, the film running silent on a flat screen, recruits leaning forward like seabirds sensing the pull of wind. He asked them to describe everything they saw, and then everything they heard. He had learned to ask first before he judged. That small patience transformed him into a better teacher than he had any right to be. On the other side of the fence, some things hardened. The narrative of humiliation is an old comfort to certain human hearts. Those who had found solace in a loud arrogance did not surrender their taste for it easily. There were op-eds that claimed the range was a microcosm of institutional softness, of being led by feeling instead of function. There were men on social feeds who insisted that Morgan's restraint was a political act, that her silence was a performance. They shouted their dismissals into comment sections no one read. Morgan continued not to answer them. She found, in the quiet of practice, a way to let noise prove itself useless. These tensions came to a head at a joint exercise months later when Allied units from two countries met on a stretch of scrubland the map labeled Training Area, Northern Corridor. It was an exercise designed to test not just marksmanship, but collaboration, medevac coordination, long-distance communication, the fragile physics of trust when lives are measured in seconds. Morgan had been invited as a technical advisor. She sat inside the command tent with maps spread on plastic, pencils lined up like small sentries. The gatekeeper was there, too, but his presence was unremarkable now. A man who had earned the right to be at a table by showing he could be quiet and useful. A foreign contingent sent their own representative, a man named Vanek, who carried with him the same kind of arrogance as the gatekeeper had once wielded but sharper, a public figure used to being proven right and paid for it. Vanek had the posture of a man who taught people to shout at bad weather. He spoke quickly, his sentences designed to be quoted back with applause. "We do this our way," he told the tent, palms beating the air, "because our methods save time. Speed is everything. Hesitation gets people killed." His tone boxed the table like a gauntlet. The room tilted slightly. Some of the younger officers brightened, the way people do when presented with certainty. Morgan observed him through the flat glass of her reserve. She had no desire to be the person who argues with a loud voice. She believed that competence, once demonstrated, dissolves empty rhetoric without much ceremony. The first day of exercises tested a chain of actions: recon over open ground, medevac of a simulated injured soldier, and a marksmanship test at extreme range. The weather was capricious, wind shifted like a living thing, the smell of rain coming and then leaving like a rumor. Military exercises, even the rehearsed ones, carry enough unpredictability to keep hubris honest. On the second day, during the medevac portion, a simulated casualty fell into a narrow gully after a mock demolition went slightly wrong. The casualty was a live actor with moulage work that made the pretend wounds look like honest sorrow. Teams leaned into the scenario with professional gravity. Radios chirped, boots slipped in the mud. Vanek immediately took the floor, his voice loud with directives the way men use commands to cover a lack of detailed planning. Evacuate. Immediate. Secure the area. Where is the overwatch? He barked questions as if questions were weapons. The gatekeeper stepped forward with a clipboard and pointed to a grid. We've got Medevac 2-1 on approach, he said. We'll secure slope A and pack the litter on my mark. His voice carried the new humility of a man who had been rebuilt by his mistakes. He did not speak to be heard. He spoke to be understood. Morgan was assigned to the Overwatch team. The plan called for a suppression element to cover the extraction while a medic and 2 runners pulled the casualty. Everything depended on timing. The wind was a variable, the slope an active hazard, and there was the invisible consequence of people who assumed they knew more than they did. It was then, within the muddied, folding choreography of the exercise, that something else happened. A real, unexpected injury broke the simulation. One of the runners, an eager private who had never seen the work of reading wind, slipped and rolled down into a gully, shoulder impacting a jagged stone. There was a wet, dissonant sound as his breath trickled. Someone on the extraction team shouted for a medic. The scenario mutated into an emergency because human bodies will insist on their own chemistry. The real boy on the ground had a fracture and the sharp brightness of pain. The reprieve for professional arrogance is that in true emergency, the loudest mouths have to do what they say or become obstacles. Vanek called for extra security, for more bodies and more commands, as if command could be manufactured like a barricade. Radios exploded with the noise of brand names and orders. Morgan watched the private's chest rise and fall, watched the medic press fingers to a pulse that thudded like a small drum. The gates of training closed and the real, ethical mathematics of care opened. Fingers must be steady. Voices must be clear. Time must be counted in breaths. Morgan moved because the work required it, not because the camera would catch her. She crawled down the slope, small, controlled movements, knees finding purchase where moments before anchors had been shaky. Her hands were already trained to find what mattered: a pulse, a pocket, an airway. She checked the private with an efficiency that made the medic pause and let her, because the medic, like most people in the presence of someone who knows, deferred. She placed a stabilizing brace with the quiet authority of someone who had set bones in a tent lit only by a flashlight that had gone through the same weather as the patient. She spoke 3 sentences in low cadence, directions, not sermons. Keep him still. Watch breathing. Don't move his neck. The private's eyes fluttered. He looked up at Morgan, dazed, and there was the small, human recognition of a life that had been held by steady hands. Vanek, who had been shouting, fell silent in the face of the urgent choreography. He realized, listening, that his words had been hollow. The gatekeeper barked for a litter team, an organized formation with the clipped language of someone who had genuinely learned. Men and women moved like clockwork. They did the work. It was, in that moment, a demonstration of the story the plaque had been trying to teach. Competence quieted the room. The medevac was executed without fanfare, stretchers leveled, straps tightened, radios pinging coordinates with the efficient brutality of necessity. Afterwards, in the command tent, when the after-action reports were written and hands shook with the kind of relief that tastes like motor oil and lemon, Vanek approached Morgan. He did not have the energy for bluster. He walked close enough that the tent's canvas muffled his voice into a private thing. You moved like a machine, he said, the sentence stripped of its earlier swagger, replaced by recognition. Clinical. Efficient. The compliment was awkward. Compliments to the quietly professional often are. Morgan looked at him for a measured beat, weighed the man's face as if balancing evidence. We do the job, she replied, minimal as ever. We take what's in front of us, and we fix it, she said it plainly, and he heard that the sentence carried no lesson pending. In the weeks that followed, the medevac became a chapter in the training modules, a case study. Compassion under control. The officers wrote in bullet points. Swift movement. Prioritize airway, breathing, circulation. Morgan was asked to brief on the practical elements of improvised stabilization in austere environments. She stood in front of a room of officers and recruits and described the smallness of the work, the angle of a brace, the grip on a strap, the way to brace a shoulder while keeping the spine neutral. Her voice was not theatrical. It was a blueprint. She used the language of practice, terms like neutral spine, traction, tuck, and hold. And she spoke in lists, in steps that were precise and efficient. The room listened. Vanek took notes. The gatekeeper read along like a man renewing vows. There were, naturally, people who still wanted the story to end in public spectacle. The feeds that had once traded in moral melodrama wanted bloodless spectacle, a dramatic apology filmed, a sign, a televised awarding of a medal to the quiet soldier. Morgan's promotions were announced by formal letters posted in official channels. She went to the ceremony with a hairnet and a uniform pressed like a pledge. The colonel pronounced her achievements without sentimental flourishes. He had always liked the lean clarity of language. For undisclosed operations and exemplary conduct in training and field medicine, Morgan, redacted, is recommended for promotion to staff sergeant, the citation read. She took the ribbon in one practiced motion, saluted, and stepped back into the fold of work. No interviews. No spectacle. She valued privacy for the same reasons a watchman shuns applause. The job was not about adulation. Still, what the colonel called to mind in the citation was the ledger, competence appended as record. It solidified respect in bureaucratic language. The gatekeeper, who had been part of the committee, stood tall that day and clapped with honest hands. That ledger did more than settle an argument. It stitched the episode into the institutional fabric. Trainees were taught the Range 6 clip and the medevac as if they were 2 pages of the same manual. The moral was taught as practice rather than as theory. When silence persists, it is not a failure. It is a calibrated reserve. The story became a tool, the kind of teaching that does not require rhetoric, only practice. In classrooms, instructors would sometimes pause and ask the recruits to close their eyes and imagine. What does silence reveal after action? They would answer with the nervousness of people newly forced into humility. It reveals the work, the gatekeeper told them. It reveals who is willing to be useful. Morgan, for her part, continued to practice the same small liturgies. One evening in autumn, when the wind began to smell like leaves and the base lights cast long shadows across the tarmac, she found herself alone at Range 6. She carried with her a small tin of oil and a rag. She wanted, in that personal hour, to clean the rifle she had used in training for medevac simulations. There was no need to do it. Regulations demanded nothing more than standard maintenance. But there is a difference between need and reverence. She liked the cadence of scrubbing, the tiny movements that measure out time and prepare the mind for attention. As she worked, a young corporal came into the range office, bringing with him the latent anxiety of someone new to duty assignments. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a long time without speaking. Finally, he said, "They told us about the shot. We watched the clip." Morgan did not look up. Her hands kept moving. "What did you see?" she asked. Her voice was a question not baited with ego, but shaped to guide. He hesitated, then spoke in fits and starts. At first I thought it was a fluke. Someone with a knack. Then I noticed the way you held the rifle. The pause before you squeezed. It was like a metronome." He laughed, a small, nervous sound. "And the silence afterwards. It made us think. We tried to recreate it. We failed. Mostly." He rubbed his palms together, and there was the smell of gun oil in the room, mingled with the soft, dry tang of a winter blanket stored nearby. "How do you get that?" he asked, earnest. Morgan set the cloth down and regarded him, the overhead light catching the ridge of a scar at her knuckle. "You strip what's unnecessary," she said. "You keep only what matters. You practice until your hands remember where everything is. Then you let events decide whether you are right." She offered him nothing more than practical instruction. He nodded as if relieved to be refused the promise of shortcuts. "Do you ever feel like shouting to be heard?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. She considered it, and then shook her head. "No," she replied. "You don't get into this for applause. You get into it because there will be days when someone will need a hand. Then you will want to be useful." The corporal watched her fold the stock into its case, watched her tuck the rag away like a small, secret ritual. The silence between them was not empty. It had a weight like a folded flag. "I'll try," he said finally. Morgan nodded once and handed him the rag. "Start with the rifle," she instructed. "Learn the smell of its metal. You will learn the rest." There are moments, in the arc of careers lived in service, when reputation and myth begin a slow cross-current. Morgan's became a reference point for other quiet professionals who had no desire for the light. Pilots who had flown trapped birds out of storm, medics who had stitched in blackout shifts, EOD techs who had defused devices with nothing but a pattern of patience. These people began to email, to drop by in off hours, to leave small notes pinned to the range board. We saw. Keep going, some sought instruction. Others simply sought the thin confirmation that someone else valued the ledger over applause. Morgan responded in the only currency she had, time and craft. She sat with them in quiet rooms and showed them the technique for minimal movement, how to harness breath against adrenaline, how to make language an efficient tool rather than an echo chamber. The gatekeeper, who had become the kind of man who could learn in public, watched these small networks form with an odd mixture of pride and regret. He had, in his years, been confronted with his own limitations and discovered they were less shameful than the alternative, never recognizing them at all. He began to mentor younger non-commissioned officers, sharing the blunt lesson he had learned. Never let the need to be right outweigh the need to be useful. If you're wrong about someone, he would tell them, fix the verdict and fix your process. You learn faster when you listen than when you shout. People nodded, taking the line into the soft files of their lives. Outside the base, the story grew teeth of its own. Veterans at cafes would lean across counters and tell the Range 6 tale like other old men telling sea stories. You should have seen the room, one would say, voice low, as if lowering volume made a story more credible. Not because the shot was pretty, because of the silence afterward. That's what you remember when noise has no value. New recruits who had heard the story for years considered themselves prepped for judgment and were surprised to find that what followed was mostly a test. Can you do the work? If you could, then the room would quiet and respect would swell like tidewater. If you could not, the room's silence would be full of consequence. That last kind of silence is the one that tests people most, the quiet that tells you your hands were not ready when they had to be. Morgan lived inside that economy of silence like a steward. Her life's work was not a moral to hang above a fireplace. It was the quotidian discipline of arrangement. Yet even as she kept the pieces in their places, a narrative was taking shape around her that was larger than any personal ledger. It became a teaching tool across units, a stabilizing story in a culture that often inflated speech and undervalued quiet labor. Teachers used it to instruct, commanders used it to correct, recruits used it to orient their restlessness. The story's currency was simple: demonstrated competence demands respect. But stories, once they become useful, attract complications. Not everyone wants to be converted by an example. Many prefer the dialectic of opposition. A new commander, recently assigned from a politically prominent post, and one who had built a name in public relations as much as in maneuvers, arrived with a brief: modernize, streamline, make the base a beacon. He loved metrics, time saved, ratings raised, numbers that could be packaged for external audiences. He loved the sound of his own pronouncements at the podium, and his speechwriters loved him back. He called new meetings and instituted new reporting lines, all designed to make bureaucratic rhythms smoother. Many applauded the efficiency. Some, who remembered the Range 6 lesson, worried about the measure of efficiency that prized optics over work. This commander, Colonel Haynes, held a morning brief with select officers. He walked in, sleeves rolled, smile practiced. "We'll transform our training," he declared. "We'll prioritize what gets attention. We need to be visible in our success." He flashed the metrics onto a screen, green bars and arrows pointing up. The gatekeeper, sitting in the front row, felt a chill. He had lived through the taste of being judged wrong, and he recognized the scent of seductive simplicity. "Metrics are tools," he said when given the floor, and he tried to shape his caution into a language the colonel might appreciate. "But they must not replace judgment. Some things cannot be measured in quarterly reports." Haynes smiled, patient in the way of men used to being right. "You worry too much about intangibles," he said, and his voice carried the echo of a man who believed in the power of projected image. "Show me a number, and I'll show you value." In the room, faces gathered like storm clouds. Some officers found easy comfort in the new clarity, a path forward, a chart to follow. Others remembered the plaque and the way competence had been proven by action rather than appearance. The gatekeeper knew that the old story was at stake, not for himself, but for the culture. He wondered, with a low fear whether a command that prizes optics could starve the quiet work that keeps people alive. Morgan heard of the new program through the neighborhood of rumors that surrounds all base changes. She watched the memos pass and the younger officers strategize. She did not attend the meetings where policy was decided. She attended to her tasks. But the coming test arrived in the form of a new evaluation, a public demonstration of training that would be filmed and streamed, designed to showcase the base's modern capabilities. It would be watched by external stakeholders, politicians, and social accounts hungry for visual proof of progress. Haynes planned a spectacle, a parade of precise actions, a sequence of choreographed efficiency designed to look neat in a 2-minute highlight reel. Everything would be rehearsed to the point of predictability. The gatekeeper, upon learning the details, felt the old caution flare. He remembered what happens when people train for cameras. They start to build spectacles, and the harder work rots in the shadow of show. He tried to persuade the colonel to include a training module that was unspectacular but essential, a live, unscripted medevac exercise with random variables and a judgment panel that would not intervene. If the demo goes wrong, he argued, we'll learn what to fix. If it goes well, then we have real evidence of competence. Haynes frowned, the way a man frowning at a suggestion that threatens his narrative might. We do not want risk, he said. We want confidence. The word fell like a stone. There was a tension then, a strain in the base's fabric. Rehearsed excellence and the truth of readiness are siblings that sometimes argue over the dinner table. Morgan watched the plans being made and felt a low, old instinct in her bones, the awareness that when performance is prioritized, the rehearsal of truth yields to the rehearsal of optics. She kept her mouth shut, as ever, and her attention sharpened. She maintained the rifle and the brace and the small rituals that keep muscle and mind aligned. If a lesson was to be learned, she thought, she would prefer it come from action rather than spectacle. The day of the public demonstration approached with the weather humming like a crowd. Trucks rolled in and technicians set up lights that made the hangar gleam like a stage. Drones hovered like patient flies, capturing angles. Colonels and civic leaders took their seats. Haynes walked among them with his hands clasped behind his back. He loved how the base transformed into an organism radiating competence simply by the virtue of appearing competent. This is how we inspire, he murmured to the press liaison beside him, and she nodded in assent. The gatekeeper, who had learned the usefulness of quiet challenges, insisted on a single change. He asked for one scenario to be unscripted, a medevac exercise with real variables, nearby terrain, and a randomly chosen casualty. His reasoning was simple. If you refuse to let a demonstration be tested by probability, you lie to yourself about readiness. Haynes opposed it on principle. The risk was small, he said, but the possibility of a mishap would ruin the public message. The argument between them was not loud. It was a careful, painful negotiation. The gatekeeper finally won a small concession. The unscripted drill would occur, but with conditions. The demonstration would happen late in the program, after the pre-planned sequences had shown the base's polished image. It was not an ideal victory, but it was a victory. The night sky edged toward the color of a smoldering theater as cameras returned for the final pieces. People were hungry for a tidy ending to the day, and many thought the unscripted part would be a decorative epilogue. No one expected the world to remind them that surprise is the teacher that prefers not to be lied to. The demonstration field had been chosen for its visibility, a broad valley, windswept, with a dune line and a field where flags snapped like small drums. The cameras rolled in, panning across ranks, catching the sheen of harnesses and the smile of a commander who likes being visible. They set up the casualty in a way that will always make the heart accelerate. The hour before the sun disappears always carries a certain sacrament, and the casualty was placed with limbs askew to amplify the sense of urgency. Radios cut and rejoined. Teams moved in the practiced manner of those who have prepared for both public eye and private exigency. It was then that the unforeseen happened, as it often does in a world that refuses to be domesticated by schedules. A gust of wind, stronger than the models had predicted, redirected a tethered drone. It clipped a support cable, sending up a flurry of sand and making the casualty's position shift unexpectedly. The canvas of the staging slipped. The simulated wound changed its angle. The stunt, which had been rehearsed to the millimeter, became, simply, real. Panic, in public, is ugly. Performance, however, can be brittle. Radio calls cracked like frost. Haynes froze in an almost comical way, his brain waiting, like a man who had purchased the idea of control but had never had to exercise it. The gatekeeper inhaled and began to speak in the clipped language of people who have had to teach themselves the vocabulary of readiness. Stabilize and respread, he called, snapping into hands-on coordination. But this was not an exercise with tidy choreography. People had to find their rhythm within unpredictability. The cameras, trained for spectacle, found their lens and waited. Morgan moved toward the dune like someone answering a summons. She had no reason to perform. Her reason was to be useful. Her hands found the casualty with the calm of someone who had read this book many times and was not surprised by plot twists. The wound was in a place the rehearsers had not prepared for. She steadied it and checked for shock. The medic's hands were steady but new. Morgan provided direction without condescension, a line of simple commands. Open airway. Prep stretcher. Hold C-spine. The team did what was asked. The litters went down the dune and the extraction began under the wild now of the wind. The cameras captured the efficiency but missed the smallness that made the action real. The private who kept a face in the wind. The medic who adjusted a strap with a practice thumb. The gatekeeper who took a position on the edge of the operation like a watchman returning to a vow. The demonstration, which had been intended to be a curated highlight, became instead a raw measure of whether training had been embedded into conditioned reflex. The extraction was messy and effective in ways that were indistinguishable to a streaming audience from theater. People clapped later, overwhelmed with relief that no one had been harmed and impressed, some finally, by the reality of competence, which does not always photograph well. Haynes, who had once feared only optics, watched as the operation unfolded and felt something in his chest that was not displeasure. He realized that the demonstration he had wanted to stage was useless if the people involved could not handle what might go wrong. He had, in a slow revelation, been forced to reassess the ledger by watching a demonstration of practical competence. The gatekeeper, standing muddy and quiet at the edge of the field, allowed himself a small nod. It was the sort of acknowledgement that does not need to be loud to be heartfelt. When the day was done, and the lights came down like a slow exhale, people talked among themselves in low voices. The cameras had caught the extraction, and the demonstration had been used as a teaching artifact that could be dissected and archived. Online, the footage spread not as a 2-minute highlight, but as a clip worth study. People who had once argued the base was all image now found themselves watching the same frame where a pair of hands, unadorned, had steadied a wrist and saved the day. It is easy, in a culture that prizes narrative spins, to claim credit for things. It is harder to live in the ledger that records what was actually done. The day set new rules in motion. People began to talk about training that did not bow to the camera. Haynes, who liked to be right, found himself quietly asking the gatekeeper to consult on future programming. Morgan returned to the barracks that night smelling of wind and sand, oil, and the faint metallic tang of adrenaline. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the plain satisfaction of work done well and the slight fatigue that comes from living in a charged environment. She slept deeply, and woke to another day of small, faithful duties. She had no hunger for retelling the day. She knew that legend is a poor substitute for a ledger. So she continued to go to Range 6, to teach, to polish, to advise, to correct. The plaque on the wall collected the light and the dust, and people still stopped by it to read the modest inscription. Where assumptions were corrected by action, for Morgan, it was not a monument. It was a signpost. And yet the story kept spreading, like a quiet contagion. Units elsewhere began to adopt the unscripted module, a raw exercise with real variables that could not be controlled. They learned things they had not known they needed to learn. They began to teach recruits the small pause before action, the micro-silence people took when they sifted for what mattered. They taught the lesson the gatekeeper had learned and relearned: ask first before judging. They instructed officers to let unscripted drills be messy and instructive. Some places added a small plaque, because institutions love artifacts, and plaques make stories official. Others simply took the lesson into their procedures. The ripple was not a tidal wave. It was steady and domestic, like the spread of a good recipe in a family kitchen. There were, of course, detractors who insisted that these changes were merely window dressing. There were men and women who complained that the new modules slowed progress. There were politicians who loved simple solutions and found the ambiguity of unscripted training inconvenient. Arguments are endless in human systems. They are the wheels that keep bureaucracy moving. But the granular power of competence persisted. It did not always win the day, but it kept residuating the standard by which people judged fitness. The ledger grew. Names were written into it, and the record kept a strange, stubborn honesty. Morgan kept her silence about fame, about the plaque, about medals. She answered questions with the same short clarity. Do the work. Keep the rifle clean. Practice the small things she refused, politely, the special dinners and the interviews. She believed in the way small rituals preserve the world's shape. She believed that silence had economies, that it conserved power and attention for the moments that demanded them. The lives that learned her lesson did not owe their courage to her publicity. They owed it to the slow accretion of competence made visible by action. The file cabinet where her record sat thickened with the things that could not be photographed. A string of commendations, a list of hours logged, the terse, bureaucratic language of a service record. The ledger, in the end, is not glamorous. It is clean and exact, like a well-maintained rifle. On the one-year anniversary of the Range 6 incident, the base held a quiet memorial. No speeches, few cameras. The colonel had insisted that the day be marked with a simple ceremony, an opportunity for those who had been there to gather and reflect. The gatekeeper, whose life had been altered by a brass case and the silence that followed, organized the event. He invited the staff who had taught, fought, and learned. He asked Morgan if she would accept the small honor of placing a wreath on the plaque. She agreed, though she did not know why. Perhaps, she thought, there are times when rituals are useful because they place things in the correct order. The base gathered and people stood, in their uniforms and their civilian clothes, and watched as a simple circle of greens was laid against the wall. The ceremony ended with no vows except the quotidian ones. Be useful, ask before you judge, keep your ledger clean. People dispersed into the cold air and the smell of the base, carrying with them the story as a map. The plaque glinted in the light and then faded into the dullness of another day. Morgan walked away with her hands warm from the wreath's ribbon. She had no desire for the kind of immortality that consumes privacy. She preferred the quiet immortality of a ledger that will be consulted long after she has packed away her uniform. And life continued. Missions were flown, medevacs were executed, new recruits fouled their drills and learned in the margins. The gatekeeper continued to teach the art of asking before judging. Vanek returned to his country with new notes in his notebook about the value of quiet competence. He sent Morgan a small letter months later, a simple line thanking her for what she had done. She kept the letter in a file, among other small tokens that point toward a life lived being useful. The colonel retired, and in his retirement speech he said, as he always had, that respect is a ledger you keep by watching people when they do the work. His words were read and folded into doctrine. Yet the story of Range 6 was not finished. Stories like that do not stay quiet forever. They find their way into the curricula of new schools, into the modules of joint force exercises, into the offhand conversation of veterans in bars. They become, slowly, mythic, and myths are useful to communities because they conserve the lessons people have found hard to keep. The practical wisdom of Morgan's life, the economy of silence, the insistence on competence over show, spread in ways small and consequential. The base, for its part, learned to value both spectacle and the messy truth that often followed it. For many, the moral was simple. When silence persists after action, observe it carefully. There is always something to learn. The narrative was far from over. There were chapters still to be written. There would be new tests of culture, new politics, new commanders and gatekeepers. The quiet professional archetype would face other trials, and quiet competence would have to fight for its place among louder claims. Morgan herself would be at the center of some of these moments, not because she sought ceremony, but because she practiced a way of being that made her indispensable. She would continue to teach and to be taught, to correct and be corrected, to do the work in a way that left no room for cheap applause. For now, the ledger held what mattered, an archive of measured actions, and a proliferation of small, effective changes. A culture had shifted a little bit. No revolution. Only the cumulative effect of people who chose to be useful rather than victorious in public. And though the story would be sharpened and softened by retelling, its core would remain as precise as a sight picture. Competence, demonstrated, is incontrovertible. Arrogance, loud and unchecked, is brittle. Respect is earned, not assigned. The plaque on Range 6 would continue to collect dust and light. People would continue to stop and read it, and sometimes, when they did, they would think of a brass case bouncing in the sand, and a silence that asked them what they would do when the talking stopped.